the story I'm going to tell is the story of how Shakespeare went global. Obviously, as a quasi-religious figure whose relics are kind of almost religious objects for the English people. They were bound to take them with them as their empire spread across the world. And I think the English had a very set idea of what taking Shakespeare out into the world would do. And I think that idea was often, it often didn't work quite how they thought it would. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the next little while. So as Nick says, I grew up in Kenya, and despite the fact that I spent a lot of my childhood on safari, driving around some of the most beautiful places in the world and looking at animals, I was a very bookish child. So I was often bumping around in the back of a Land Rover with my nose stuck in a book, looking at that rather than at the wildlife. As with every British school child, I was given a certain amount of Shakespeare, but I didn't really see any connection between Shakespeare and the world that I was living in. And so this only really came out, making these connections only happened a long time afterwards. It actually started in 2011. So my college in Cambridge was staging a celebration of the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. So the King James Bible is the monumental translation of the Bible into English, often thought of with Shakespeare as one of the two great monuments of the English language. So again, if you go on Desert Island Books or Desert Island Discs in the UK, it's a radio show where you get to pick what you're going to take with you to a desert island. You get 5 books, but you get Shakespeare's complete works and the King James Bible for free, just because if they didn't give you that, everyone would say, I would take the complete works of Shakespeare and the King James Bible out of a sense of duty and worthiness. And to be fair, the fact that that they are extraordinarily beautiful books as well. But so we were staging this celebration of the King James Bible, and as part of that, we decided to have people read out passages from the Bible in as many languages as we could find speakers. And so we had people reading them out in Greek and Latin and in Mandarin and Cantonese and all sorts of other languages. And I foolhardily volunteered to read out a bit in Swahili. So I had Swahili, fairly kind of ropey Swahili from when I was a child. And I tracked down the first translation of the Bible into Swahili, which was by a chap called Edward Steer, who was the 3rd missionary bishop to Central Africa from the university's mission to Central Africa. And I read out part of the beginning of the Gospel of John. Mwanzo palikuwa na neno, neno akawa maungu, neno akawa kwa Mungu. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? In the course of researching this, obviously missionary work is something that we're all fairly familiar with from the history of imperialism and the history of global relations. In the course of researching this chap and finding his translation, I came across the curious fact that the Bible wasn't the first thing that he translated into Swahili when he arrived in East Africa. Actually, the first thing that he translated into Swahili was a slim volume of stories from Shakespeare, right? The Hadithi za Kiingereza, right? Or stories from the English. So this wasn't a translation of a Shakespeare play, but rather 5 tales from Charles and Mary Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. I've had a kind of moment of disconnection and a possibility of connection between 2 very separate parts of my life. And just the fact that this chap was translating Shakespearean stories into Swahili in the 1860s on the island of Zanzibar seemed like a very strange set of events. So I also realized that this was my chance, having become trapped in the rainy island of England to have an excuse to go back to Kenya to do some research. So I got a research grant and I went to Zanzibar to look into this chap, Edward Steer, and his translations of the Hadithi za Kiingereza. And it's an extraordinary story. The Hadithi za Kiingereza, for any of you who know anything about any Arabic or anything about Islamic culture, you might recognize the word hadith, right? So the hadith are the traditions of the Prophet that along with the Quran are the sacred texts of Islam, right? So as well as the Quran, which is the revelation which Gabriel gives to Muhammad, you also have the hadith, which are the traditions about the Prophet's life. So the fact that Steer has chosen hadithi za Kiingereza, these are the traditions of the English, right? So he's out there in Zanzibar in the 1860s and providing these African school children. So this book, the Hadithi za Kiingereza, went on to become extremely popular and influential. And for over 100 years, school children in East Africa learned the East African language of Swahili, through reading Steer's translation of these Shakespeare stories. So again, this is a fascinating story of cultural hybridity, of course, cultural imperialism, and linguistic imperialism, even though they were learning Swahili. So if you may not know very much about Eastern Africa, but Swahili is now spoken all over Eastern Africa. That is in large part an imperial imposition. So the British arrived, like the Portuguese did, on the coast of East Africa. They met a people who speak Swahili, which is a Bantu Arabic tongue, right? It's a mixture of Bantu languages and the Arabic languages that came from traders from all across the Indian Ocean. The British learnt Swahili, and then they made everyone else learn Swahili as they went inland, right? So there are vast numbers of languages across Eastern Africa, and Swahili was imposed upon many non-Swahili speakers just so that the British could create a local lingua franca. So Swahili has this very, very interesting and problematic status, which will come up again later. It is an African language, but it's also an African language that has a certain imperial history to it. But as well as going out there and finding out about Steer and this project to translate these tales from Shakespeare into Swahili, increasingly it became clear that this was just one very small part of a much larger story. And it was a thread that I tugged at and which just kept coming and coming. And it became clear that Steer was far from alone, that in fact every 19th century traveller who went out from England to Africa took Shakespeare with them, right? So you'll find in the expedition diaries of all of the Victorian cartographers, people like Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton and Speke, who together supposedly discover the source of the Nile on one of their cartographic expeditions, right? Says explicitly in his account of the expedition that he only took 2 books with him, right? So he took the complete works of Shakespeare and he took Euclid's Elements, right? Euclid's Elements, this seems like a very strange thing to take with you on an expedition, although it might make a little bit more sense here locally, because of course Euclid's Elements was the first thing that Matteo Ricci translated into Chinese, right? And I think that's a clue as to why this pair of books. Euclid's Elements was often used by missionaries to demonstrate the universal, absolute, and unchallengeable nature of European knowledge. So this was the game that Matteo Ricci played with the Chinese people he met in the 16th century. He showed them Euclid, this extraordinary text of Greek mathematics, and they were amazed. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever read Euclid. It's actually great fun, right? So Euclid's demonstration of his proof of the hypotenuse is an extraordinary thing. When you read it, you recognize that this is a kind of knowledge. It simply could not be true, this thing he's saying, right? So reading Euclid is an extraordinary experience of having an experience of a truth that must be true. You feel a deep conviction of its truth. So Ricci translates Euclid into Chinese and says, here's Euclid and here's our mathematical knowledge. And our theological knowledge is just like that. It's absolutely just as trustworthy, and so you should believe the Bible just as much as you believe Euclid. And I think similarly, this is what Burton is doing when he's taking Euclid and Shakespeare into Africa, that these are twin metaphysical texts, right? That Shakespeare speaks truths of the human heart, just as Euclid speaks the truths of the mathematical, metaphysical sphere, right? So Burton takes Euclid and Shakespeare with him when he goes to East Africa. And he leaves all sorts of diary entries about reading Shakespeare with John Hanning Speke, his companion. So there's lots of episodes where they're stuck somewhere because it's raining too hard, like tonight. It rains for weeks and weeks and weeks, and they have nothing to do but sit around and read the two books that they have. Obviously, no one's going to sit around reading Euclid, so they sit around and they read Shakespeare to each other. This happens in lots and lots of different expeditionary, it's even a genre almost of expeditionary Shakespeare stories. Here I am out in the wilderness reading Shakespeare. There are some very funny elements to this genre. Quite often it involves talking about the Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is a very strange thing. I mean, The Two Gentlemen of Verona is not one of Shakespeare's more successful plays. It's right down there in the bottom 25%, definitely. So again, confusing. Why do they keep going on about The Two Gentlemen of Verona when John Hanning Speke had the unforgivable good luck to be the actual person who discovered the source of the Nile when Burton was away, and therefore had this kind of claim to historical fame? Burton retaliated by quoting in his published version of the expedition a line from the Two Gentlemen of Verona, a very misogynistic line, right? He said that of Speke, he said that the fortunate discoverer's conviction was strong, but his reasoning was weak. He was like the damsel Lucetta in the Two Gentlemen of Verona, who says, I have a woman's logic. I think it's so because I think it's so, right? So he writes off Speke's luck in this discovery by saying he may have found it, but he had no good proof. But again, he's quoting from the Two Gentlemen of Verona. Again, why this play? It's not a great play. It makes more sense when you realise that in the first folio, and Shakespeare's plays right up until the Oxford edition in the 1980s followed the same order of plays that they'd put them in the first folio. The Two Gentlemen of Verona is the first play, right? So you imagine it got many more readings than most of the other plays. Simply because people would sit down to read the complete works through and not get very far. So lots of readings of the Two Gentlemen of Verona out in Africa. So again, this becomes this tradition, and there are dozens and dozens of examples of people producing their expeditionary memoirs and making very clear that they took only one book with them, right, which was the complete works of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare becomes this kind of cultural arc, like the Ark of the Covenant, born into the wilderness, and I think it serves two purposes, this kind of story, right? One of which is kind of like the Ark of the Covenant, Shakespeare's ability to survive in these inhospitable climates, right, demonstrates the kind of sacredness of Shakespeare, right? That he somehow is it's almost like a sacred object that is somehow protected from existing in these environments. It also serves the purpose of, to a certain extent, demonstrating for these people Africa's unreceptivity to Shakespeare, right? So Shakespeare is something that these people can't understand. I'm going to tell a story that illustrates this in just a second, but there's a sting in the tail of it. So as I say, this tradition of expeditionary Shakespeare grows and grows. Perhaps the crescendo of it is Teddy Roosevelt, who, after he finishes being president of the United States, decides to take an expedition to East Africa, and he takes with him an entire library. He calls it the Pigskin Library, right? He talks about how he has the books bound in pigskin, because whereas most bindings fall apart through overuse, that pigskin, when it gets gun oil and blood on it, only gets nicer, right? So this is Teddy Roosevelt's cowboy Shakespeare, right? His Shakespeare is bound in pigskin. It's supposed to look like a revolver holster. It's something that, as he toughly goes through Africa on his hunting expedition, it gets a kind of patina of his own manly grit, right? This is all slightly reduced for the fact that Roosevelt did shoot something like 263 different species of animals on his expedition to Africa for the Smithsonian Museum. He did a lot of this from sitting on the cowcatcher at the front of his own private train carriage, right? So he just sat on the front of the train and they went slowly through Africa and he shot things and people would go and collect them. So it seems a little less tough when you realize that. But so Roosevelt is in some ways the kind of crescendo of this. But before I move on to talk about the much more interesting story of what happens when Shakespeare gets out of the proprietorial hands of these expeditionary readers and starts to be read by people, by Africans, I'll just tell one last Shakespeare story, perhaps Shakespeare on Safari, Shakespeare expeditionary story, which is perhaps the greatest one of all time. And this is told by Henry Morton Stanley, who again is a great kind of adventurer in the late 19th century and a master of self-invention, right? So he was born John Rowlands in a Welsh, and he spent a lot of his childhood in a Welsh workhouse, like an orphanage. He was abandoned, but he eventually made his way to America, and he reinvented himself as Henry Morton Stanley, right? And he fought in the American Civil War on both sides, right? And eventually, he was clearly just a fantastic storyteller. He eventually managed to blag his way into getting the New York Post to send him out to Africa to look for David Livingstone when David Livingstone went missing. So David Livingstone is this great missionary who was sent out into Africa to convert Africa to Christianity, right? He only actually ever converted one person, and that person lapsed shortly after that. But he was this great celebrated figure in the 19th century, and he eventually went missing in Central Africa, and Stanley was sent out to go and find him. And Stanley makes his name by coming across, he finds David Livingstone, who doesn't realize that he's lost, right? And famously, nonchalantly, Henry Morton Stanley greets him by saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." So this kind of, "Oh, fancy seeing you here." And he comes back and he makes a huge name for himself as this kind of great great hero, great adventurer, who's able to do the most daring things and remain witty and nonchalant at the end of it, right? So Henry Morton Stanley is this great self-inventor, great storyteller. He returns to Africa again later in the century, in the late 1870s, again to try and find an even higher up source for the Nile. And being Stanley, he has no idea what he's doing. He actually ends up in a different river that comes out onto the coast of West Africa, the Lualaba River, right, that goes into the Congo River. So he becomes the first person to make a descent of the Congo River, and he managed to spin that into something heroic, right? But he does it almost entirely by mistake. So he tells a story from this expedition that he's on this Lualaba River in West Africa, And he says that he had been seen writing by the local people, and that they considered this very bad magic, right? And that they insisted, that they were getting together a war party to attack Stanley, and he thought, and they demanded that this magic that he'd been seen doing, writing, must be burned, right? And he says, I couldn't burn it because it was my expedition diary, it was my expedition notes, it was everything that we had seen and everything I'd written down. And I had only one other book with me. What was it? Complete Works of Shakespeare, exactly. So he says, so I can't burn my diary, so Shakespeare is going to have to be the sacrificial victim, right? So all of you who know anything about Christianity will recognize this as the gospel story, right? The blameless Christ goes off to be burned into the fires of the inferno to suffer for the sins of others, right? And Stanley writes this extraordinarily melodramatic crescendo scene, and he says, and I approached the flames, and my poor Shakespeare was dropped into the inferno and consumed, and a great cheer went up from the relieved natives that the white man was good and that the village was saved, and so on and so forth. Now, the sting in the story is that we can tell from Stanley's expedition diaries that this is entirely made up. Right? Like everything else in his life, it's entirely fabricated. There are little bits of things that happen that are somewhat like this, but this story in this form did not happen at all, right? So it really serves the purpose of giving to an English-speaking audience what Stanley, the great storyteller, knows that they want, right? And the great irony here, of course, is that here, and this is not the only one of these stories, there are many of these stories about, benighted Africans believing in magic and thinking writing is magic. It's actually obviously the English who think that the writing is magic, right? So here is Shakespeare, the sacrificial victim, Shakespeare, the Messiah who saves them, and many of these characters are clearly carrying Shakespeare kind of like an amulet that they think will protect them against the barbarism of the dark continent of Africa, right? And in fact, Joseph Conrad reproduces this in a couple of his novels. So Heart of Darkness, which you may know. If you don't know it, you may know the film adaptation Apocalypse Now, right? Features Mr. Kurtz, who in the film is Colonel Kurtz, who goes off in the film in Vietnam, but in the novel in Africa, in the Congo. And he gets lost in the interior and he goes insane and he makes himself into a god of the local people. Now, one thing that Conrad drops in a kind of offhand way is that Kurtz doesn't have any books with him, right? He only has his own diaries, and he goes crazy essentially by having no connection to the outside world, no connection to society. And he goes crazy by simply, being enveloped in the dark continent and having only his own increasingly insane thoughts to keep him company. And the opposite version of this is Conrad's novel Lord Jim, right? Tells almost exactly the same story about a brave white man who goes off and lives with different people. Lord Jim, if you know the novel, turns out to be a hero. He sticks by his virtue. He doesn't become maddened and insane like Kurtz does. Difference, he has a copy of Shakespeare with him, right? So again, it's this bizarre kind of ritual narrative about the power of Shakespeare to save the English from these benighted people around them who, and again, the kind of insidious logic of this is Shakespeare's aesthetic value is universal, right? Anyone should be able to recognize, any human should be able to recognize the beauty and significance of Shakespeare. Ergo, if you cannot recognize the beauty and significance of Shakespeare, you are in some sense not human, right? So it's a kind of proof of the inhumanity for these people, for the explorers, of the people around them. Now, the extraordinary irony of this is that as Roosevelt was riding his train into the African interior and shooting things and being, the Shakespearean cowboy, actually he would have been going past lots of African villages where people were reading Shakespeare in Edward Steere's Hadithi za Kiingereza. So from Edward Steere onwards, Shakespeare actually quite quickly became part of local mythology, local folklore. There are huge numbers of instances of so in Zanzibar itself, in the early 20th century, a bunch of missionaries go to see a play that is being put on in a local village, right? And halfway through the play, the missionaries realize that this is a performance of Macbeth, right? Now, the people doing the play have never heard of Shakespeare, and this is something that has bled through their schooling and that have kind of adapted and made part of their own culture. There's a similar, there was a similar story from the early 20th century. Again, a British ethnographer goes out to East Africa and goes to the Swahili coast in northern Kenya. And she's trying to do research on local linguistics and local culture, and she recruits a local school teacher, and she says to him, tell me a story of your people. And so he proceeds to tell her a story called The Story of the Flesh of the Thigh, right? And again, inevitably, halfway through the story, she realizes this is the story of the Merchant of Venice. And she asks him, sorry, this is, where did you hear this story? Are you sure this is a story of your people? He says, no, actually, I heard this on the beach from an Indian merchant, right? So again, this is the other thing that starts to happen, really in the late 19th century, which means that the narrative that the British had hoped of a kind of purely British cultural gift to the world, or cultural imperialism of the world, swiftly got out of control and was no longer something that was really just a one-on-one relationship between them and the people over whom they were, imposing imperial rule, colonial rule. Because in the late 19th century, Shakespeare became immensely popular in India. So in both an official and an unofficial way. So in an official and imperially imposed way, if you were an Indian person who wanted to have a job in the Indian civil service, you had to pass an exam. That exam almost entirely consisted of learning about Shakespeare, right? So the Indian civil service, but there was also a popular tradition of adapting and translating Shakespeare plays. It was estimated that by 1920 there were 4,200 translations of Shakespeare plays into Indian languages. And these were immensely popular, right? And when in the late 19th century the Indians were brought over by the British to build the railroads in East Africa, right? So they had all the people who built the railroads in India were brought over to build the railroads in East Africa, to connect the various British colonies in East Africa. The Indian labourers brought Shakespeare with them, right? And there are these glorious photos, which I don't have here to show you today, but and stories about immensely popular Shakespeare productions in Mombasa on the coast of Kenya. From about 1906 onwards, right? So these were things done in Indian languages, apparently, sold out performances, highly irreverent, just as Shakespeare would have been himself. So Shakespeare, as I say, pillaged everything he ever wrote, and was not particularly sanctimonious about it. He changed whatever needed to be changed to make the story work. And these modern adapters were exactly like that. So there's a wonderful Indian Romeo and Juliet, Indian Twelfth Night, which starts quite poignantly, given that these railway workers were doing it, not with a shipwreck on the coast of Illyria, as Shakespeare's does, but with a train crash, right? So there's a train that plummets off a railway bridge, and this is where Viola and Sebastian, or how Viola gets stranded in this place. There is a wonderful Romeo and Juliet, and this one I particularly love because of its interpretive quality, in which Juliet, instead of stabbing herself with a dagger at the end of the play, uses an asp, a snake, to poison herself, just like Cleopatra does, which I think is a rather nice little bit of kismet, because I always like to think that if things had happened slightly differently and Juliet had lived past Romeo and had lots of other men, as she probably should have, she would have ended up a bit like Cleopatra. And there's a sort of wonderful interpretive quality that this playwright has seen, a kind of a fateful link between Juliet and Cleopatra. So anyway, Shakespeare's there in East Africa, but he's not just there, as these expeditionary writers are assuming in their kind of sacred copies that they're bearing with them into the dark continent. He's there everywhere. So again, finding its way into local folklore, being performed by Indian railway workers, and again, consistently continues to be a kind of touchstone for thinking about both a kind of cherished source of narrative, right? And again, I talked a little bit about this on Saturday, about this insidious notion of poetry is what's lost in translation, right? This is, for me, the most kind of awful kind of cultural protectionism. It's a way of saying, even if you translate Shakespeare, what you're reading isn't Shakespeare, right? Well, that's not proper Shakespeare. Shakespeare, only the British, and only really a native-speaking British person can appreciate the grace and the beauty of Shakespeare, yeah, because all the actual poetry has been lost in translation, right? This is a nationalist gimmick. Again, there's plenty of parts of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is a great constructor of narrative, and there's no reason why that can't be translated. And there's lots of Shakespearean metaphor and writing that, again, is not remotely reliant on the specific form of the words. There's a wonderful bit, it's in a rather minor play, in which Shakespeare describes fame by the following metaphor. He says, glory is like a circle in the waters that never ceases to expand itself till with broad spreading it dispersed to naught, right? So you have this image of a pebble being dropped in a pond and getting bigger and bigger and thinning out as it goes. And that's what fame is like, right? It's a beautiful image. There's no reason why that can't be translated. Pebbles and ponds and puddles act pretty much the same throughout the world. Here I am harping on about water again. Yes, as I say, Shakespeare is there. He's everywhere. I'm not quite sure. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. How much longer? Right. So there are so many of these stories, and I have to pick and choose which ones to tell you. So again, Shakespeare crops up in the writings, for instance, of Karen Blixen. I don't know if you will know the film Out of Africa, or the book Out of Africa. This bit is in the book, it's left out of the film. There's an episode in which she's reading The Merchant of Venice, and her houseboy Farah comes in, and she tries to explain the story of The Merchant of Venice to Farah. And Farah is completely unsatisfied, right? And he says, Shylock, this is ridiculous. So the story of the Merchant of Venice, he can take an even pound of flesh as long as he takes no more, no less, right, and doesn't drop any blood, right, because he's not allowed to spill Venetian blood, right? Forrest says, why didn't he use a red-hot knife? He could have taken little bit by little bit, putting it in a scale until he had exactly 1 pound of flesh, and it would have cauterized the wound, wouldn't have spilt any blood, right? So this is Farah's solution, right? And it's partly a funny story. She's saying, she's illustrating that East African stories are different, right, in some ways. That she's saying East Africans like the ingenuity of the tale rather than, a tale in which you take sides. That's a kind of morality tale. But actually what Blixen is trying to do is she's trying to illustrate an early form of what would come to be known as cultural relativity, right? Blixen, I think in a kind of good-hearted, although ultimately, to my mind, wrong-minded way here, is trying to say that cultures are different, right? They cannot understand each other. Our stories don't make any sense to them. And this is part of Blixen's argument that the Gikuyu who live on her land should be allowed to maintain their own traditions because we have cultures which are incommunicable to each other, right? And obviously, Blixen's desire to allow the Gikuyu a certain amount of cultural autonomy is an admirable thing. There's lots of other kind of assumptions that she makes about the nature of Africans that we would find rather problematic nowadays. But this notion of cultural relativity develops as the 20th century goes on. There's a very famous article by an anthropologist called Laura Bohannon called Shakespeare in the Bush, which features a similar, it tells a sort of similar story. So she tells a story about how she goes out to Nigeria to do some field work on the Tiv people. As some of us do, she misplans her research, so she shows up and it's the rainy season because she's supposed to be there researching farming methods, right? But no one's doing any farming. And all they do during the rainy season is they get together every day and they sit in the elder's hut and they drink all day long and they tell stories, right? So after several weeks, Bohannon can't put it off any longer. It's her turn to tell a story, right? And she can't think of a story. So she decides to tell them the story of Hamlet, right? And she's there and she's explaining the story of Hamlet to these Tiv elders. And they're having none of it, right? And they start correcting her and asking questions and saying, no, that can't possibly happen. The Tiv don't believe in ghosts, right? So that part of the story makes no sense to them. In Tiv culture, it is very normal for when a man is deceased, for his brother to marry his wife. So Hamlet's anger at Claudius for marrying Gertrude makes no sense. This is clearly the way that it's supposed to happen. Ophelia could not possibly have drowned because only witches can drown people, etc., etc. So what Bohannon is trying to do here is she's trying to tell a story which demonstrates that Shakespeare is not universal, right? Shakespeare makes no sense to these Tiv people, and therefore the cultural arrogance of the British in believing Shakespeare's universality is disproved by this story. Now, don't get me wrong, I can't stand the cultural arrogance of the British any more than any other person. But I think that the story is also, it sets out, it doesn't discover this in the course of it, right? This is what it set out to do. It even features a pompous Oxbridge Don at the beginning of it who asserts the universality of Shakespeare and then gets proved wrong, because there's nothing anyone loves better than disproving a pompous Oxbridge Don. Right? But, actually the objections that she's making in some ways need to be further thought about. I mean, Shakespeare's audience didn't necessarily all believe in ghosts, right? Hamlet was written at a time when the idea of ghosts was a profoundly problematic concept. There's all sorts of things in Hamlet that are things that Hamlet's original audiences would not have believed in that sense, right? And so, this is one part of an argument that unfolds over the course of the 20th century, in which Shakespeare is constantly brought to the fore in Africa, and in my telling in East Africa, it happens elsewhere, but I focused on the parts of Africa that I know best, as a sort of litmus test for questions of universality, right? So the question, is there anything that everyone can agree is beautiful and significant and meaningful and interesting, or are we all isolated in cultural structures? Bless you. In cultural structures of our own, enclosed cultural structures that mean that we will never really properly understand one another. So, on the one hand, of this argument is this cultural relativism argument. Here's funny stories about British people trying to assert the cultural universality of Shakespeare and finding that they can't get anywhere because people don't understand what they're talking about. The other side of this argument, which, as I say, I think, obviously it was an important corrective in the period to a kind of arrogant assumption of the universality of very culturally particular views. But to my mind, this is a rather kind of depressing conclusion, that there's nothing that we can say to each other. And in fact, I think there's plenty of reason to believe that this, not that we should think in terms of cultural universality as in a kind of post-metaphysical world. It's unclear where that universality would reside, but that we can find things of shared interest as different cultures, and that other cultures' readings of our cultural materials can be incredibly enlightening and significant. And so I'll just spend the last little bit of the talk talking about a couple of the ways in which Shakespeare was interpreted by African readers in the last half of the 20th century. So again, this very much continued this course of this process of bringing Shakespeare into East Africa or into Africa. So a good example of this, and a rather surprising example of this, is Che Guevara. So Che Guevara spends a lost year hiding out in the Cuban embassy in Dar es Salaam after leading a failed revolt. So he hides out in the embassy in Dar es Salaam, and he asks for certain books to be sent to him, so he can have them in the embassy in Dar es Salaam. And you've guessed it, among them is the works of Shakespeare. So the idea of Che Guevara spending a year in Dar es Salaam reading Shakespeare is a rather odd one. But at more or less the same time, the first president of an independent Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, was translating two Shakespeare plays, Julius Caesar and The Merchant of Venice, into Swahili. These were the first full translations of Shakespeare plays into Swahili, and Nyerere was doing this at the very same time that he was writing the Constitution of Tanzania, right? So there's this kind of odd disparity between the fact that he is trying to create the Constitution for an independent Tanzania in the daytime, and in the evening he's going home and translating Shakespeare. And I think there are, there are significant reasons for this. So there are some sort of superficial reasons. Nyerere was a great, an ardent advocate of Swahili becoming a kind of East African language. So this is, again, a period of decolonization in which Pan-Africanism was a very strong idea. The idea that in order to resist colonial and post-colonial oppression, Africans needed to stick together. And they needed to find things that they shared and build blocks that were capable of resisting the imperialism of Western nations. And so Nyerere was determined that that Swahili should be spoken across Tanzania. And again, this is one of the kind of great success stories. So Tanzania is filled with very, very good Swahili speakers today, and Julius Nyerere's work has a lot to do with that. But I think Nyerere also came from a background in which appropriating the little god of the English, right, Shakespeare, for their own purposes, right, was something that is seen throughout the independence movements in East Africa. Perhaps most importantly, beginning at Makerere University in Kampala, which is the kind of jewel in the crown of East African universities. It's where most of the post-independence leaders were educated. They started an annual Shakespeare production there in the late 1950s. And again, I would say ironically, but it's coming to, by this point in the story, it's coming to seem like an inevitability rather than a strange coincidence. Many of the post-independence African leaders met each other in Shakespeare productions at Makerere University in East Africa. And there was a famous one which was happening at the same time as some riots in a production of Julius Caesar in Makerere, and the students. It was happening at the same time as the riots. The students had the people who were playing the Romans, the conspirators, so Brutus and Cato, the people who killed Caesar, were dressed as Askaris, that is, as British East African soldiers, right? The story is told about this, and again, it's a story told about how East Africans are not capable of understanding Shakespeare. There's one story that's told about this, that everyone cheered and laughed when Caesar was killed, right? But it makes a lot more sense when you put this in the context of these people are all participating at that time in an attempt to overthrow the Ugandan, the colonial Ugandan government. The story is also told that the production had to be called to a halt because the rioting had reached the campus, and the faculty had to protect themselves from the stones being thrown by the rioters by picking up the shields, the Roman shields, used by the actors and cowering under them. The man playing Julius Caesar in that production was none other than Milton Apollo Obote, who would go on to become the first president of an independent Uganda. So there's this, Nyerere comes out of this extraordinary environment in which, because of the imposition of colonial education, you have these independence leaders who are highly educated in a very Shakespeare-heavy environment, and who have concluded that appropriating this knowledge of Shakespeare, appropriating Shakespeare for themselves and for their own expressive purposes is an extraordinarily kind of powerful weapon. So I think Nyerere is also showing by translating Shakespeare that Tanzania is a cultural force to be reckoned with. But I think he goes further than that, in that it's not just reverential Shakespeare. He does his own thing with it. And the choice of the two plays that he translates, Julius Caesar and The Merchant of Venice, are, I think, kind of significant in this, in that Julius Caesar, for those of you who know the play, know that it's not really about Julius Caesar at all, right? Julius Caesar is actually quite a minor character in it. And it's really about what happens after revolutions, right? What happens, so most of the play takes place after the assassination of Julius Caesar. And it's about how people start to distrust each other once the revolution is over, right? So whilst the momentum is going, whilst they have a common purpose to kill Caesar, they're all one. And then as soon as Caesar's dead and they have to decide how to cut up the spoils, how to organize the state, they all start to distrust each other, right? And I think, so this is part of what Nyerere is reflecting on in translating Julius Caesar, because he inevitably was himself meeting the challenges of having to organize a state from scratch with many competing interests. He was also trying to articulate a particular kind of African socialism. Right, so Nyerere and a few of the other Pan-Africanists had a strong belief that Africa didn't need to follow exactly the same path towards socialism, towards Marxism, as the rest of the world. And part of the reason for this was that African communities were not based around nuclear families, right? So at the heart, in some ways, of Marx or more Engels' account of capitalism is the fact that capitalism in part develops because you hoard stuff to give to your kids, right? So the nuclear family is part of the problem with capitalist societies. Now, African families are not organized like this. People live in multi-family gatherings in which everything is held in common. So Nyerere's feeling was that that Africa could essentially leapfrog a lot of the stages that other socialist experiments had gone through by taking a different route, by making it more specifically and locally African. The version of socialism that they would follow, and I think in his translation of The Merchant of Venice, we see this particular word choices and ways he chooses to translate things. In that, again, for those of you who know The Merchant of Venice, it opens with Antonio, the merchant, right? So yes, a lot of people, again, the Merchant of Venice is Antonio. He's not, in some ways, the central figure in the play. So everyone, when they think about The Merchant of Venice, they think about Shylock, right? And if not, they think about Bassanio and Portia, the love story, right? But actually, the titular character of the play, the Merchant of Venice, is Antonio, the person who lends Bassanio the money to go off and court Portia, right? It seems like a slightly unheroic part to play. But I think there's a way of seeing The Merchant of Venice in which actually Antonio is a kind of central character. When we meet him, he's very sad and he doesn't know why, right? And a lot of people have interpreted this in 20th century literary criticism that he has homosexual desire for Bassanio, and that what it really is that he doesn't have the language in which to express this love, or he's not allowed to have this love for Bassanio. And I think that's that there are reasons behind that. But I think actually it's very telling that Antonio, who has spent the entire play being rather depressed and listless, actually finds peace at the end of the play at the very moment when he's about to be cut up by Shylock, right? So I'm just going to read the speech out here because it's such a beautiful speech. He says, so the judge has given his judgment. They're going to the court, and Antonio believes he's about to be, cut into his flank by Shylock and will almost certainly bleed to death. And he says, I am armed and well prepared. Give me your hand, Bassanio. Fare you well. Grieve not that I am fallen to this for you. For herein fortune shows herself more kind than is her custom. It is still her use to let the wretched man outlive his wealth, to view with hollow eye and wrinkled brow an age of poverty, and from which lingering penance of such misery does she cut me off. Commend me to your honourable wife. Tell her the process of Antonio's end. Say how I loved you, speak me fair in death, and when the tale is told, bid her be judge whether Bassanio had not once a love. Repent but that you shall lose your friend, and he repents not that he pays your debt. For if the Jew do cut but deep enough, I'll pay it instantly with all my heart. And I think one of the touching things about this is that in the moment that he thinks he's going to be sacrificed, what Antonio finds a release from is the alienation that man feels dealing constantly with things of wealth, of money, and the self-sacrifice, the physical self-sacrifice that he's able to give to his friend is a kind of glorious literalization of this metaphor for value that people so constantly deal in, this alienated metaphor for value that is money. And finally, he's able to give his friend something that's actually valuable, his own heart's blood, right? And I think in part what Nyerere, I suspect, saw in The Merchant of Venice is it as a story about the ways in which a man in his alienated state in modern capitalist culture can be redeemed by various acts of sacrifice for others, right? And that there's a particular kind of nobility in that. So I've spoken quite a long time. There are huge numbers of other stories here which I could tell. So Shakespeare is also plays a central part in the resistance to the regime of Haile Selassie, being translated into Amharic by a wonderful poet called Tsegaye Gebre Medine. He's also in a bizarre episode translated into Juba Arabic in South Sudan and becomes the first act on the world stage of the new nation of South Sudan, is to bring translation of Shakespeare's Cymbeline to the 2012 Olympic Games, where there was a festival of Shakespeare. And it's a very bizarre story which led at one point to the fact that in Juba, on the banks of that branch of the Nile, where Juba is an extraordinarily poor place, and again, at the time when I visited, was experiencing a brief lull in violence, into which it has subsequently recollapsed. There was a plan then, 2014, when I visited, to build a replica of Shakespeare's Globe in Juba, right, as a sort of celebration of Shakespeare's central role in the founding of this new state of South Sudan, which has a lot to do, again, and again, I think, our narratives of our introspective narratives of colonial guilt are absolutely right. They can be a tad narcissistic in not recognizing that these things go elsewhere. In South Sudan, English was an emblem of resistance to the imposition from the Arabic North. So for them, they actually wanted to perform this play in England, in London, in English. They were not allowed, because that was not sufficiently exotic for the organisers of the Globe to Globe Festival. So they were made to perform Shakespeare in Arabic, the language of their oppressor, in the Shakespeare. So, as I say, this story has a huge number of different kind of angles and elements, and lots of stories that I haven't gotten anywhere near, but I think you've probably heard enough of them now. So I'll stop there, and if you have any questions for Glenn or I think we'll try to answer them. So, Nick or I? more questions. There's one at the back there. Skulking in the back.
Yeah, this is okay. So thank you for both your presentations. And I know very little about Shakespeare. Maybe that says a lot about me. But one thing I wanted to kind of quiz you both about, or try to draw a connection, because I think it's interesting, the two talks, the physicality of the book, and then the taxidermy from Roosevelt. So that idea of that, the museum and the way in which authors and books kind of persist and as objects. And I thought, Nick, your discussion about the pages themselves, the structure of the folio is something that I didn't know about, and the physicality of it. So I wonder if either of you have anecdotes or a perspective on the body of Shakespeare itself and that kind of cult of personality around it, or some sort of theories or something, because again, I know very little, but is there something there about taxidermy and Shakespeare's body?
I like the way you look at me.
I'm sure Nick has a story about a copy of the first folio that claims to be bound in Shakespeare's skin.
I wish. No, I wish. One of the strange things is, it's all we really have is the book, and then there's earlier quartos, and possibly, one manuscript page and a few signatures. And there's certainly, we know about Shakespeare's life through second-hand reports, through legal depositions, through what Ben Jonson, other of his contemporaries said about him. In fact, we know a surprising amount about Shakespeare compared to many of his contemporaries, such as Thomas Kyd, who wrote the Spanish tragedy, we think. But that hasn't stopped later historians, commentators, and pseudo-historians from saying, well, we know so little about Shakespeare that maybe he didn't exist. So there's a tension really between the fact that the books have survived, and that's one of the reasons I'm interested in that sort of tourist industry of association items and relics. But there was a decreasing amount of those through the 18th century. So the trees disappear. You could go and sit on the chair, but you could also take a sliver of the chair, and eventually it was sold to a Polish princess and has now, of course, disappeared. But the most sort of striking example of this is the fact that the grave is empty. And that's probably because of the composition of the soil in Stratford-upon-Avon. But it's been surveyed.
Zombie Shakespeare.
Sorry?
I said zombie Shakespeare.
Zombie Shakespeare, yes, or vampire Shakespeare. But it has now been archaeologically surveyed, and it does appear to be, if not empty, at least there's not much there. Now, it's very interesting because I've just written a piece about English identity being rooted in ruins and remains and in the tangible history, but the most sort of central figure of English culture, and I think also of British culture for that matter, being Shakespeare, is that so little is actually there apart from the books which carry the language, which carries the plays, which carries the words, and that's the thing that survives. I think that's one of the things that the Romantics tried to do, rather than sort of venerate the relics, because they come straight after this sort of huge. The forgery case I alluded to was an absolute sort of scandal because so many people were taken in by it, and it lingered on. Was this attempt to internalise Shakespeare, and so to make Shakespeare something more of a sort of an internal emotional experience rather than something that was linked to specific places and sites and so forth. So that's the best I can do. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know about any. I mean, I'm sure there are sort of Victorian taxidermy sort of scenarios in which they've got sort of like squirrels playing with the parts of Macbeth. Something they have very similar things. But I don't know whether you have any ideas.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I think to continue from that, I think in a way, and kind of like Christ of whom there are no relics, right? The physical departure of Shakespeare has meant that the word, so instead of having the corpse, you have the corpus, and it's over the corpus of the works that people fight, right? So again, Nick will know very well that, current Shakespearean studies, it's a ridiculously kind of antagonistic world of people, as in academia, fighting over small rewards. One part of it is divided into lumpers and splitters, right? So those lumpers who are happy to accept everything as Shakespearean, and the splitters who are constantly saying, well, actually, that probably wasn't written by Shakespeare. And there's ferocious, battles between them about what should be accepted in the Shakespearean corpus and what should be rejected from the Shakespearean corpus. But it's very similar to the kind of arguments about relics. What's a real relic? If you've got 8 million pieces of the true cross, someone's going to be needs to be exercising some kind of quality control here. I think there is. That there is this kind of veneration of the corpus, and again, I think this takes shape in kind of textual ways. So one of the and it works. There's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the physical, the physical embodiment and the cultural phenomenon. In that Shakespeare is, in English, the text which, like the Bible, tends to be produced on very thin paper in double columns. And what that means is you can have the entire complete works in a very small vade-mecum volume that you can take with you everywhere. And this means that people do that. They bear it with them like a relic that they take with them, right? And again, the debate, the long-standing debate on, should a copy of a Shakespearean text, like one of the Arden editions, be absolutely festooned in footnotes, right? So you've got this much text at the top of the page, the rest is footnotes, which demonstrates the canonicity of his writing by showing quite how much interpretation, right? So that one might take to be the equivalent of the kind of scholastic commentators of the text. Or, on the other hand, should it be a clean page like the Globe edition, the Actors kind of edition, which is just the text, none of this nasty scholarly nonsense getting in the way of Shakespeare's pure words, right? So, in a very similar way to that kind of debate over the word capital W, which is a sort of a body, a corpus. Yeah, I think there's a similar. Again, I mean, in some senses, that's a typical academic's trick of having found an association that I could make, which makes it look like I'm answering your question.
Well, I enjoyed your answers, and I look forward to the zombie Shakespeare.
I was saying, we should clearly be working on that film scripts. Yes.
Shame we can't get the Facebook crowd in, but
just so the Facebook crowd know, we've answered all questions about Shakespeare. No questions remain.
Okay, well, in that case, I would like to thank those of you who've made the trip, because this wasn't when we expected to be giving this talk, and there's been a number of changes over the past couple of days. But first of all, I'd like to thank Edward. Secondly, to thank Ricardo and his team. But most of all, thank you for turning out. So thank you, and thank you to those on Facebook.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.